Hey guys, welcome to the next part of the TurbulenceFD series for Cinema 4D. In this part, we're going to continue on talking about the container object. Now, in the last part, we were discussing the container tab here, and we were going over things like the voxel size, the grid size, all of the different options here for the cache, and we even went over what a voxel is. So what we're going to do in this part is continue on with the simulation tab. So what we're going to do, because you can see we've got quite a few options here, is I'm going to start down at the bottom and work my way up. So I'm going to try to keep this as fun as possible because there's a lot of options here. And if we go through every single option and make a change and then simulate to show the change and what it looks like, we're going to be here forever because there are so many different options and things that you can change in here. There's a lot of values and settings, and I don't want to make this boring for you. So I'm only going to be hitting on the major values that everyone is going to be using most of the time. And then maybe in another video, we'll come back and discuss the minor things because I don't want to be here forever. And I'm sure that you don't want to be here forever either. So by default, there's only one channel that's turned on. And I don't think a lot of people realize this. So if we twirl down burn, you can see that it is not turned on. If we twirl down fuel, that one's not on either. Neither is density. However, temperature is turned on by default. So I've got a sphere here inside the container, and I'm going to right click on it and give it a TurbulenceFD tag. Now by default, all of the values here are set to 0. Now we're not really going to get into the tag properties right now, but everything that's set to 0 is basically off, and anything above 0 is on. So there really isn't an on and off switch for the emitter. It's basically just 0 is off and anything above 0 is on. So the only channel that was turned on back over here in the container is temperature. You can see all the other ones are turned off. Temperature is turned on. So let's emit some temperature here from this sphere. So we'll just quickly simulate that. And there's a very basic temperature simulation. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that those other three channels are not turned on. So a lot of people that are new to this plugin tend to want to create some type of fire simulation. So they'll do something like this only using temperature. They'll hit render and there's the flame. But that's not really the way it works in real life. Well, kinda. But the issue here is that you're shading the temperature channel. You're not shading burn, fuel, or density. And a much better option for this would be the burn channel for fire versus using temperature. Now, I'm not saying that we should turn temperature off. I'm just saying that temperature should be left on and it should be kept invisible and not shaded because a high temperature would cause the air to rise rapidly, and that's what we want for our flame. But we just don't want to actually shade that temperature channel. So in the case of wanting to create a simple fire animation, then what we would want to do, rather than use the default setting here, is we want to use burn. So what I'll do is in the emitter tag, I'm just going to give it a value of 1 for burn. And like I said, we want to keep the temperature value on because without temperature actually driving the fire upward, it's not going to look right. So once we have it turned on here in the emitter tag, we need to go back over to the container and we need to turn it on here in the simulation tab. So we'll turn it on there because it needs to be enabled in both places. If your object is emitting burn, but the burn isn't turned on here, well, it's not going to work. It has to be turned on and enabled in both places, here in the simulation tab of the container and also in the emitter tag for the object that's going to be emitting the flame. So we'll click start to simulate this again. Okay, so that's looking kind of weird. Let's find out why. So we want to create fire, but that looks exactly like it did before. So the reason for this is because the viewport preview is set to the temperature channel, and we need to change it. We don't want to view temperature, we want to view burn. So I'm going to change the channel over to burn, and now we can see what the burn channel looks like. And we also have the option to use a shader. So by default, none looks like this. It's this yellow, green, blue type of shader. We changed it over here to fire. Now we have a fire shader. So we'll go back over to the simulation, and we've got some different options here for the decay mode. Now, usually I tend not to mess with this. I leave it at linear. And the reason for this is because if we set this to the other mode, which is exponential, what this mode does is it subtracts a percentage from the value. And the lower the value gets, the lower the percentage being subtracted from it gets. So what that means is that your flame is going to be lingering around in the air for a very long time, almost like dust slowly dissipating in the air. Now, I personally don't know of any flame that gets emitted from an object that lingers around in the air unless it's got something that's fueling it to do that. So typically for fire, you want to leave your decay mode set to linear. I have yet to use it in exponential. All right, so this looks more like a flame that would be on the end of a candle wick or maybe a match head. And if we scrub through the timeline, you can see it's not really looking, I mean, it looks like fire, but it's not really the type of fire that I want. I want more flames, and I want it to be a little more wild and turbulent. So we can go up here to the turbulence, and we can turn that on. So by default, it's set to 0. So what this does is it brings in some random turbulent velocity into the container here. So basically, you're just adding turbulence inside of your container. So one thing that I found is that it's always good to go up in small increments when you're using different values here. However, in the case of turbulence, I've found that sometimes you can actually jump up pretty high without things getting too crazy. So I originally tried a value of 5. You really couldn't see it. Then I went up to 35, then 85. And I found that a value of about 350 will give me what I want. So if we click start, we're really not going to see the difference just yet. Now you can see we are getting some more detail in there, whereas that detail was not there before. You can see we've got the little jagged lines in there, almost as if it's wanting to do something, but there's something more we're missing. So what we need to do is go down here to the smallest and largest size. Now what these two settings do is the smallest size, it specifies the smallest size of the curl of the flame, or the turbulence, depending on what you're using, because of course there's no smoke in here, but if you were emitting some type of smoke in the density channel, then it would be determining that as well. And the largest size specifies the largest size of the curl of the flame. So I want to take the largest size and I want to go up to something like maybe 10. So we'll resim that. And now it looks more like fire versus a small flame that you would see on a candle wick or a match head. Okay, so basically that's how you would create some simple fire to get you started. Now, of course, there's other options. We'll get into that a little later, but that's basically the burn channel for you. I tend to use burn a lot for fire. Of course, you can use the other channels if you want to for fire as well. Let's talk about an option for that. So the next one here is going to be fuel. Now the fuel channel, it will emit fuel. Now most of the time you don't actually want to shade your fuel unless it's going to be catching fire, which I guess in most cases actually it's better to say that yes, you will be shading your fuel, but it's only when it catches fire, because you can emit the fuel out into the air, but if it never actually touches an open flame, well then you're not going to be able to see it unless you shade it with the density channel to give it kind of a misty white type of vapor look to it. So a really good example of how to use the fuel channel is actually in the examples folder in the plugin, or in the plugins directory, I should say. So if we go over to the plugin directory, and you can just get to it by going to Program Files, Max On, you can see I'm still living in ancient times with R13, plugins, go to your TurbulenceFD folder, and then in the examples folder, we have a bunch of examples that we can look at that the developer has supplied us with that can actually help explain and teach us how to use these different properties. So the one that we want is going to be called Simple Ignition. So I'm going to open that up. So basically what we've got here is a sphere in the middle of the scene. It's going to be emitting a flame. The plane over here on the left-hand side, you can see the plane here has an emitter tag, and it's only emitting fuel. And it's going to be pushing it using the force option here for the normal force. You can see that that's up to 400. And what that's going to be doing is pushing the fuel outward to the right. However, if we go back over here to the container object in the fuel channel, you can see that the fuel mask channel has been set to burn. What this means is that we're not going to be able to see the fuel actually burn until that fuel hits the open flame and catches fire. So if we hit start and start simulating this, we've got an open flame. Now we can't see the fuel. It's being emitted. We just can't see it until it touches the open flame and catches fire, which should happen any moment now. So there we go. Now if we were to take this fuel mask channel here, and if we were to set that to say something like none, what's going to happen is that we're going to see the flame from the very beginning, because the fuel channel is being done here with the burn. So if we go over here to the viewport preview, we can see that channel is burn, fire shader, the rendering for the fire shader is set to burn. And if our fuel is burning, well, then it's going to be shaded with the fire shader, which is for the burn channel. So if we start this simulation again, there you go. So there's really nothing special about that. It's emitting fuel, but the fuel is immediately burning. But if you don't want your fuel to immediately catch fire, if you want it to wait until it actually touches an open flame and then ignites, then what you need to do is supply the correct mask channel, which in this case is going to be burn. Okay, so one more thing about the fuel channel is expansion. Now also you can see here we've got temperature and density emission. So you can actually get your fuel to emit temperature and density. Now I believe by default, I believe those settings are turned off, but you can always turn them on if you want to experiment around with that. So the expansion property here is something that sometimes I like to play around with because you can get some really nice effects with that. Expansion basically just expands the fuel outward, almost like an explosion. So remember what this looked like the first time when the fuel came out and touched, and then it ignited as it touched the open flame. So if we were to take this value up to say, I don't know, let's try maybe a value of 5. And we'll start it again. What that means is that the fuel is going to expand, and we're going to have a much larger expanded ignition of the fuel. So you can see just how much larger the flame is now when it touches that open flame that's coming from the sphere. And if we really want to get wild with it, let's go to something like 15. And I'm going to hit start. We'll resim this again, and now this flame should be a lot larger because it expands out more when it ignites. So that is the expansion. Now you got to be careful with this because you can see it's still expanding over here as it's coming off of the plane. So this may be an issue where you want to maybe keyframe this value here to where it expands really large at first, but then as the flame moves backwards towards the plane, you can bring this expansion value down and keyframe it to come down to maybe something like 0 or 1 or wherever you want it. So that's some basic stuff there of the fuel channel. So the next one would be density. Now the density is what I normally use for things like smoke, mist, dust, or dry ice vapor or something like that. That's what I use basically in an older animation I put together. I believe it's still on my channel here, and it was called the dry ice experiment or something like that. I basically just used the density channel and changed the color of it from the grayish brown color that is by default over to a white color. So I'm going to turn those off. We'll go over here to density. We'll turn on density. I want to go over here to the emitter tag, and I'm going to change the density value to 1, turn off burn. I'm going to keep temperature on because I want it to rise. We need to go over to the container object, and we need to go to viewport preview, and I want to see the density channel, and I'm going to shade it with the smoke shader. We'll go over here to rendering, and for the smoke shader, I want to change this over to density. So by default, I believe the smoke color is set to like a brown grayish type color, but I've gone ahead and I've changed it to this white gray color here, just so we can see it a little better in the viewport. So if we sim this really quick, there's our smoke. You can see it is quite turbulent. Now the reason for that is because we still have turbulence on. and it's making it look a little too turbulent for my taste. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to go back and turn the turbulence value down to something like maybe 25. So for the density channel, it's pretty easy to understand. There's not really anything here that should be too confusing. You have the density diffusion, you have your dissipation and a half-life. Basically, this just determines how long it's going to be in the air before it starts to dissipate. Maybe you want your smoke to go up higher and linger around a little longer, or maybe you want it to dissipate really quickly. That's what you're going to have to play around with here. And of course, it just depends on your scene. It depends on the scale of your scene, depends on what you're trying to create. Everything that you do, everyone's scene is going to be different in some way or another. So you'll just have to play around with the dissipation in order to get the right type of effect you're looking for. Of course, we also have gravity and gravity direction. Pretty easy to understand. Next one is going to be temperature. Temperature we've already been over. It basically gives you almost the same properties as density, except we have a cooling value here with a half-life. And this cooling value is basically the same thing that comes down here to density with dissipation. The only difference is with cooling, it determines how fast this is going to cool off. All right, so that's the temperature channel, turbulent channel here. We went over that. Now you can actually use the different channels here for the intensity channel value here. And what this will do is apply the intensity to one of these channels. However, even though we're applying it to just one of these channels, it will also affect other channels as well. I was actually playing around with this not long ago, and I was wanting to create a turbulent flame like we did back at the beginning of this video. And I was wanting to get the flame to be very turbulent, but I didn't want the smoke to be affected by the turbulence. So I changed this over here to burn, and I was getting a nice turbulent effect in the flame, but the smoke was also being affected by it as well. However, not so much as the flame was. So you'll need to play around with this a little bit in order to get the effect that you want. The next one here is going to be vorticity. By default, there is already some vorticity inside of the container object. Now, the vorticity is just those little swirls that you get when hot air rises up. It causes the smoke to kind of swirl and move around and whatnot. That's vorticity. Now, there's already some in the container by default. So what that means is that this setting here will actually magnify or amplify the actual vorticity that's already there. It just amplifies it. And of course, you've got the mapping here for it, which we'll get into that a little later. And we've got the intensity channel, which you can actually link that amplification to one of the channels. Wind, that's pretty easy to understand. I shouldn't have to go over that. You've got your wind direction, X, Y, and Z, and wind speed. You got velocity. Now, velocity deals with particles. Now, we're not really going to get into particles right now, so we're just going to skip this setting. Timing, that's pretty easy to understand as well. Time scale, 100% is normal time. If you want to do like some type of matrix bullet time effect where everything slows down, then you want to take this value and you want to bring it down. That will kind of like bring everything to a standstill or to a crawl where things are moving very slowly. This here will also give you the frame range. You can also go from and to, and you can start a clean simulation if you like, and if not, then you can load a simulation state from file, or you can continue one from file. Upresing. We're not really going to get into upresing. I've never really used it. There's a reason for it. I'll just quickly go over that. The developer has stated that it's best to actually use high-res settings and just take the time to simulate this versus simulating it at a low resolution and then going back and upresing it, because the upresed results will not look as good as a full resolution simulation. And he has specifically said that more time and effort has gone into the plugin to get really nice high simulation settings with lower simulation times versus using the upres. Now the solver, usually by default, the solver works pretty good with the default settings. Occasionally you may need to go in and take the frame substeps and go up with that. But when you go up with it in small increments. So if you're having trouble with things not working correctly, maybe you've got some intersecting problems, maybe you've got some high-speed objects going through that are not really catching the smoke properly or the fire or whatever you might have, then go up with this to maybe to a value of 2. don't go too high with it, otherwise it's going to take longer and longer to simulate. All right, so I think that concludes this part. In the next part, we'll continue on and we're going to get into the viewport preview a little more, as well as the rendering tab with all of the different options there for the smoke and the fire. So thank you guys for kind of bearing with me through all this. I know going over all of these different settings, I know it can be boring. I'm trying not to make it as boring as what it could be if we go through every single one of them. So again, thank you for bearing with me through all of that. And as always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.